This week's parsha of Matos, Moshe communicates first to the princes of the tribes and to the rest of the Jewish people the laws of oaths and vows. Before we speak about what an oath and what a vow is, in one of the tenets of Jewish faith, we say we believe with absolute faith that Moshe Rabbeinu was the father of all prophets, greater than those who preceded him and greater than those who followed him. That's a tenet in Judaism. If one does not believe this, he has no share in the world to come. What is the reason for this? Because we speak about a false prophet in the Torah. A false prophet comes and he speaks in the name of God, and his prophecy is contradictory to what Moshe had spoken. Now the question is, whose prophecy has greater credence? Moshe or the prophet who counters Moshe's position in prophecy? The basis for the Torah, for its authenticity of its divinity, is Moshe Rabbeinu. God openly chose Moshe in the presence of the millions of Jews who stood at Sinai, and we witnessed how God openly communicated to Moshe, go tell the Jews such and such. So we saw clearly, and every Jew prophesied at Sinai. So he witnessed this in the context of prophecy, that Moshe is God's spokesman. No ifs or buts. Even later, if God chose him to be a spokesman, anything that Moshe says in the name of God is the word of God. Any other prophet is only a prophet if he meets certain criteria, which confirms he's a prophet. What is the basis for that criteria? It's what Moshe communicated at Sinai is the basis for that prophecy, that a prophet is an authentic prophet. And if he should fail within that context, he's a false prophet. So he's put on the pedestal of prophecy due to Moshe. Was that Moshe is the word of God. And he's disqualified or removed from that, also from the same reason why initially he was installed as the prophet. So Moshe is the father of all prophets, the greatest of all prophets. Those who preceded him, those who followed him. So this portion begins when Moshe speaks about the laws of vows and the laws of oaths. He said, Zeh hadover. This is what God has commanded me. This, meaning it's distinct, clear, emphatic, no level of ambiguity. Zeh. Every other prophet, when he prophesied, he said, Ko Amar Hashem. Meaning it was like paraphrasing what God had said. Although the message was clear, but what God revealed to him was not what he revealed to Moshe. Moshe was a more distinct message. Therefore, it's Zeh. Zeh means this. Zeh hadover. This is what it's about. Others it's something like that. It's like a paraphrasing what God said. Now, Moshe, when he prophesies earlier, he also says, Ko Amar Hashem. He uses the same terminology as every other prophet. But when he speaks about vows and oaths, it's Zeh hadover. It's more distinct. The question is why. So the Torah only reveals the difference between Moshe and all the other prophets within the context of vows and oaths. But of course, this distinction is unilateral. It's regarding everything. But the Torah is only revealing it here. Why here? That's number one. First question. Now, the Torah tells us if one makes a vow or one takes an oath, that means one swears, and you violate the oath or the vow, it's considered you violated a negative commandment. Because it's considered you've profaned your speech. You've profaned it. The word profane only has relevance to something which has a holy status. So when you go and you violate it, or you don't uphold it, you profaned your speech. Because a person cannot make an oath or a vow unless he verbalizes it. The person thinks something should be forbidden to him. A person thinks in his mind, he's swearing, he's not going to do something, will do something. Has no value of an oath. The Torah says he must articulate it. It's called miftas rosayim. It's through the articulation of the lips. You need verbalization. Without verbalization, the vow is not a vow, the oath is not an oath. So now that you verbalized it, it assumes the status of the oath and the vow. If you should violate it, you profaned your speech, because your speech gave it a holy status, and therefore you're bound to it. So violating it, it's profaning your speech. And there's a positive commandment: you must abide by what you say. Now, what's the difference between a vow and an oath, which is just a side issue? If a person says, this book is off limits to me, and uses a certain terminology, the book itself assumes in its innateness forbidden status. And because it's forbidden, I'm not permitted to benefit from it. An oath means, I swear I won't do something. I won't eat bread. The bread is permitted, but you've imposed upon yourself an oath that you will not eat. So the prohibition is the eating, it's not the bread. One is upon the person, the other one's upon the object. But either way, the status of either of these categories becomes that, is actualized through speech, verbalization, articulation. An oath is only an oath if you swear in the name of God. A vow, there's no mention of God. A person violates an oath inadvertently. He has to bring a sacrifice. That's us. It's much more severe. A vow, it's a negative commandment. One does it deliberately, he's subject to lashes. Inadvertently, he has to repent, do tshuva. Now, the Talmud tells us that a person who does not abide by his oaths and vows, ishtu uvonav mesim, God forbid, it causes his wife and his children to pass away. Children referring to minors. And it cites a verse from Shlomo Melech. Why should God take what's most dear to you, which is the wife and the children? That is the liability of not abiding by an oath or a vow. A person steals, a person violates Shabbos, God forbid. The consequence is not, God forbid, losing a wife or losing children. One doesn't abide by dietary laws. The consequence is not, God forbid, losing a wife and children. But if you violate your oaths and your vows, that has that serious liability. Now the question is why? Why is that more serious? We find that Talmud tells us a story. Bruria was the wife of Rameir. Rameir was one of the greatest Torah sages. He was a student of Rabbi Akiva. He was a student of Rabbi Shmuel, who were the greatest of the Tanoic period. And Rameir, his wife's name was Bruria. She herself was the daughter of one of the 10 martyrs who was killed by the Romans. Rabbi Hananya ben Trajan was her father. So she didn't have a simple father, very special person, and she was very special. And she literally was like a Torah sage. That was her dimension of knowledge. And she's walking by a student, and she sees a student, he's studying, and he's not verbalizing the Torah that he's studying. No words coming out of his mouth. He's eye reading it, and he's contemplating it. So she says to him, and she had a very caustic tongue. She says, don't you realize you're wasting your time? You're wasting your time. The verse says, Chaim hi lemotzaehem. Torah only brings life for those who actually verbalize it. If you verbalize it, it brings you life. If you just meditate it without verbalization, it doesn't have the same value. It does not have the same value. So I'm giving you good advice. When you study, the Torah you study, you should verbalize the words. And then it will take on that new dimension of value. The question is why? You're studying, you're meditating in it. It has to be accompanied with verbalization. Without it, if one says the Shema, which is a Torah obligation twice a day, and I read the Shema, and with all the focus and all the feeling, and you do not articulate the words and verbalize them, you did not fulfill your obligation of Shema. You must say the words. When you say them, it should be infused with focus and intent and all that, and subservience. But if you don't say the words, one does not fulfill this obligation of the Shema whatsoever. The Kiddush Friday night, which is a Torah obligation. Remember the Shabbos, keep it holy. You must verbalize it. Without verbalization, you did not fulfill the positive command of Kiddush. You say blessings. Jews supposed to say 100 blessings a day, and one does not articulate the words. One does not fulfill the obligation of the blessing. It's as if you ate the food without a blessing. It's not predicated on a bracha. It's not a bracha. Why? What's it all about? Now, if we go back to the creation of Adam, the Torah tells us he created all species, living species. And finally, the last creation was the human being, who's the center of the universe. He's B'Tzalmo B'Demuso. He's in the image and form of God. He has intelligence, he has discretion, and he has free choice. And in addition, the Torah tells us, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim. He blew through his nostrils a soul of life. So Adam is a composite. He's a physical being infused with his soul, which is the core of his being, with a spiritual entity which has a spiritual dimension which is not to be fathomed. So it's a composite. And life is a struggle between the physical and the spiritual. That's what it is. And the Torah tells us after he infused the soul through his nostrils, it says, Vayhi l'nefesh chayo. He became a living species. What does it mean he became a living species? So there's an Aramaic translation on the Torah. It's called Targum Onkelos. Onkelos was a convert. He was the nephew of Nero, the Roman emperor. He converted to be a Jew. And he wrote, and he was from the Tanaic period. And he wrote a commentary in Aramaic on the Torah. And he translates the words, Vayhi l'nefesh chayo, Vayhi l'ruach mamalolo. He became a speaking species when he was infused with that soul of life, which is that spiritual entity. He was able to speak. The only species in existence which speaks is only the human being. No other living entity speaks other than the human being, because speech emanates from the spiritual source, which is called the soul. And since no other creature has a soul that has a life source, therefore the human being has the power of speech. No other living species has the power of speech. Okay? Every action we do, our senses, sight, hearing, touching, smelling, everything emanates from our physicality. I mean, our spirituality is touched by it, but it all emanates from our physical. A human being possesses every animalistic drive, because we're made of material. Speech does not emanate from the material, from the physicality of the person. That's a direct outgrowth of the soul. As it says, when he was infused with the soul, he became a speaking species. So we see that the soul and speech are directly connected one to another. Now, why was man put on the face of this earth? Why? To be challenged. The human being is given choice. Choice is the determining factor why you're either deserving or you're culpable. Because in essence, you didn't have to do the good deed or the meritorious deed. Why did you do it? Because you took the initiative, you chose to do it. So if it's only due to your choice and it wasn't under coercion, so if that's the case, you're deserving of what? Of that initiative. If a person is not forced to do the wrong thing and he chooses to do the wrong thing and he's not compelled to do the wrong thing through an external force, why did you do the wrong thing? Because you chose to succumb, which you didn't have to succumb. Therefore, you have liability for doing the wrong thing. That's what it's about. So the whole purpose of creation is to challenge the soul, and if the soul succeeds, it advances in the spiritual realm. That's what happens. Speech is crucial for the development of that soul. That's why when man was endowed with the soul, he became a speaking species for that reason. There's an expression in English, one's word is sacred. Where does this come from? Speech is sacred because speech emanates from the most holiest entity in existence, from a spiritual entity. It's called the soul. So when you violate your speech, you make the vow or you take the oath, what are you doing? You're creating an entity of classification which you're supposed to do or you're not supposed to do, and therefore it assumes a level of holiness. So when you violate that speech, which brought about a result, you're profaning your speech. I mean, the faculty of speech, which is a holy faculty, you're profaning it. Because you said through your verbal commitment, it should be A or B or C, and now you're not carrying through. You're not treating that classification which you created through speech as you originally designated it to be. We're going to clarify this. So why was man endowed with speech? Because it's the faculty that's necessary for spiritual advancement. Otherwise, what does it need speech for? Now, what areas does it have relevance to a spiritual advancement? We read at the first verse in the Torah, what was the objective of creation? For the sake of the Torah. The playing field, the testing grounds, is physical existence. Because of Rashis, because what's choicest, God created this world. The Torah is the ultimate. Because of the Jewish people who are called Rashis, they are the choicest. This world was created. The only people who have relevance to the Torah, which the Torah itself could expand and grow their spirituality, is only the Jew, because he possesses a very unique type of soul. The world doesn't have that kind of soul. Soul, only the Jew has that. So if we say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, when you study Torah, that's the ultimate infusion of spirituality, which is the equivalent of all the commandments combined. The verse reveals to be able to activate that infusion, you need verbalization. But what is speech? Because the Torah is the ultimate, the holiest. It's God's wisdom. You have to use the faculty of godliness, which is speech, to activate and create and generate those energies which advance the soul at a level which is equivalent of the Torah in its entirety. That's the reason why it has to be verbalized. Because the advancement of a human being is not in the physical sense, it's the spiritual sense. The physical is only to facilitate the spiritual. But what directly addresses the spiritual? That's the power of speech. And therefore, Torah has to be articulated. When you say the Shema, accepting God's dominion, it's not enough to meditate it, to eye read it. You have to say those words. Because the verbalization of those words, you're actually utilizing that spiritual faculty, which emanates from the soul, to activate it and bring about what it's meant to bring about, coupled with the intent. That's why the Shema has to be verbalized. It's not enough to meditate it. The blessing we say, the 100 blessings a day, we declare God is the omnipotent one. He's the Almighty. He's the King of the universe, whatever it is. You have to verbalize those words. You just meditate them, doesn't have the effect. But verbalization brings it to another level. It gives it that innate value. Okay, that's why. Now, we once pointed out, the Torah tells us, speaks about a leper. That a person becomes a leper, he has to be sent out of all the camps. The 3 camps, and he becomes a pariah until he recovers from a state of leprosy. Now, what is leprosy? So the Torah tells us what leprosy is. It's a tag, it's a discoloration, it's a lesion on the skin, which has a certain intensity of white. And the only one who was the expert in making this evaluation was the Kohen. And through the pronouncement of the Kohen, whether it was a leprous lesion or not, will determine whether he assumes that contaminated status, and he has to be sent out of all the camps. It's his pronouncement of that. We're not talking about leprosy, a degenerative disease. It's a tag which identifies where the person is holding spiritually. Now, why does one become a leper? One becomes a leper because he crossed the line too many times to speak lashon hara. It's abuse of speech, whether it was gossip, whether it was slander. It's in that area where speech was misappropriated into areas which are unacceptable. And if you violate that sufficiently or overload on that, it manifests itself with this lesion which identifies you as a leper. You become this pariah. You're sent out of all the camps, and you assume a contaminated status until you recover from that leprosy. So it's only through the pronouncement of the Kohen you become the leper. And the pronouncement of the Kohen that you've recovered, then you're permitted to re-enter the camp. But again, even the Kohen, it has to be a verbal pronouncement. If he goes like this or this, that doesn't make him to a leper. He has to pronounce, you are a leper. When he goes and visits him, when he hears that he's recovering, and he makes it out and he sees he's recovered, he says, now you're no longer a leper. Again, it's another pronouncement. And that allows him to re-enter the camp, undergoing certain protocols till he's fully reinstated. But again, it's verbalization. Now, why is lashon hara such a severe sin, severe transgression? The Talmud tells us that there's a certain aspect of lashon hara, speaking negative about another person in a non-constructive context, or gossiping, has a certain element which is worse than the 3 cardinal sins. There's a certain characteristic of that which is worse than the 3 cardinal sins. What is it? Man was endowed with the faculty of speech for a reason. What's its reason? What's the value? It has infinite value. Because you only activate all these infinite forces when you study Torah if you verbalize them. This is a misappropriation of speech. We're not talking about you speaking just nonsense. You're using it in a negative way to point out something negative about a fellow Jew in a negative context, and it's expressed verbally. Talmud tells us that there was no expert in lashon hara as Haman the evil. Haman, who was the viceroy of the Persian Empire, nobody could outpace him in lashon hara, in speaking negatively. What does it tell us? Haman is a personification of Amalek, the Amalekites. They're the ones who actually attacked us. After the closing of the sea on the Egyptian armies, the world trembled. There was an aura of what happened. The world wouldn't dare go near the Jewish people because they saw clearly we're God's people. And God will turn over the world for us endless times. And as we say in the Oz Yashir, they were overwhelmed. They were trembling because of what they had seen and witnessed. And you have this nomad band of people known as the Amalekites. They attack us. What do you mean? Why did they attack us? And the Midrash says it's analogous. You have a scalding bath, and people are afraid to approach the bath because they would get burnt. And you have this fool jumps into the bath. When he jumps into the bath, he's showing the world there's nothing to be afraid of. Although he gets burnt, he's cooled the bath down for everyone else. By attacking us, the aura which we had, that we are God's people at special level, he deflated that aura. He removed it. God says, because of what Amalek had done, his name should be obliterated from under the heavens, and my throne is not complete until Amalek is removed from the face of the earth. That's explicit in Torah. Positive commandment. And destroy them. What exactly did they do? So King Solomon, Shlomo Melech, in Mishlei, Proverbs says, how would you depict Amalek in terms of what they did? There's a classification called Letz. Letz is a deprecator. A person who's truly, he mocks, deprecates. He's a person, he doesn't have any lines of communication open, he's not within the realm of reason to explain things. That's how shut down he is. That's a deprecator. So Shlomo says, let's takeh. How do you deal with a deprecator? You smite him. Talking to him, convincing him, it's an exercise of futility. But what about a person is misled and he's caught up with his own inhibitions? That's why he's lacking clarity. Pesiyarin, a person who's seduced through his own desires, he could become wizened. What's the example of let's takeh? You smite the deprecator and you wizen the person who's caught up in his own interests. Let's takeh ze Amalek. Amalek you smite. If the aura and what was displayed to the world, 250 miracles and how the Egyptian armies were destroyed. If Amalek could attack us, what does that mean? They have no capacity whatsoever to appreciate spirituality. Therefore, they are the ultimate deprecators. Pesi Yarim, the fool could be wizened. That's referred to Yisro. Yisro, the father of Moshe, why did he come out to the desert and abandon all his glory? Because he heard Kriyas Yamsuf, Mechabas Amalek. He heard about the splitting of the sea and the war with the Amalekites. So he was touched. He had a capacity to be touched. Amalek had no capacity to be touched. And therefore, Bilam, in last week's reading says, Reishis Goyim Amalek. Amalek was the first nation to go against the Jewish people. Therefore, at the end of time, when God will remove evil from this world and all nations of the world will recognize God, Amalek will not have a place there. Why? That if he wasn't able to appreciate what the world appreciated after the splitting of the sea and the closing of the sea, that he displayed clearly, he has no capacity to appreciate spirituality. And since the ultimate purpose of the end of time is to appreciate who God is, these people don't have a capacity for that. And as a result of that, because they were the first to attack, therefore they will be the first to be destroyed. And they're going into the oblivion, the Amalekites. Now, so we speak of deprecation, not being able to appreciate the innate value of something. That means a person is so narrow, tunnel vision, only see one thing and everything else blocked out. So Haman comes to Achashverosh, who's the Persian king, and says, there's a nation who's scattered throughout your kingdom. We have to destroy them. He says, why? He says, I'll explain it to you. If a Jew has a cup of wine and a fly falls into the cup of wine, you know what the Jew does? Takes the fly out and drinks the wine. He says, do you know if you touch the Jew's wine, do you know what he does with that wine? He pours it out and even smashes the glass. When Achashverosh hears this, the level of disrespect, he says, immediately he gave him his ring and he sealed the fate of the Jews to annihilate every man, woman, and child. So the Talmud tells us there's nobody who could speak Lashon Hara like Haman. So the question is why? Why was he able to depict us in such a negative light that it was literally straight to Achashverosh's heart? He pierced his heart with this. The answer is because Haman personifying the characteristic of Amalek, he has no appreciation for the value of Jewish people. All their contributions, all what their value is totally blocked out. All he sees is one thing: spirituality. Spirituality, he has no appreciation for. He deprecates it, he's totally shut down. Therefore, as a result of that, he's able to pick out points which are so lethal because those points block out everything else. To bring it to a greater level of clarity, there's a story I tell this, Rabbi Ari Levin. Rabbi Ari Levin was known as the tzaddik of Jerusalem, of Yerushalayim. He was the rabbi of all pre-state of Israel when all the people who fought for independence were imprisoned in English prisons. He himself would visit them and he would transfer messages, so on, whatever it was, very popular, even among the secular Israelis. And he was exceptional tzaddik, Rabbi Ari Levin. And this person comes to Rabbi Levin and he wants to just unload about the Satmar Rav, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha. The Satmar rabbi, of blessed memory, his name was Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha. He was a Torah sage, he was a holy man, but his position was anti-Zionist. He was against the government of the state of Israel, anti-Zionist. This person comes to Rabbi Levin, and he really wants to speak about the Satmar Rav in the most negative way. So and Rabbi Levin understands where he's going, this person. He says, before you start speaking about the Satmar Rav, I want to ask you a few questions. Is there anybody who walks the face of the earth who's as kind as giving as the Satmar rabbi? He says, no. The Satmar Bika Cholim in all the hospitals in New York City, the level of chesed they do, it's unparalleled. It's unheard of. That's just a display of the chesed. And that was instituted by the Satmar Rav, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha. That it should be a Satmar Bika Cholim. Any Jews in the hospital, they provide a level of hospitality which is unequaled. It's not on their fridge. They have people coming day in and day out, delivering meals, hot meals, full meals for the people without any cost. It's given and it's done with a love, with a givingness that nobody feels they're actually the reward of anybody. That's the way it's done. And he says, is it true that if a person's in need of money and the Satmar Rav, he had people gave him tremendous amount of money to distribute and he felt the person needed, he just told him, just take as much as you need. Off his table, just take it. And one after another, the person responds in the affirmative. So for about 25 minutes, he goes back and forth, says, yes, of course that is the case. He says, now tell me about the Satmar rabbi. He says, I have nothing to say. Because when a person gets locked into that negative feeling, everything else is totally blocked out and blotted out. All you see is that one negative. I'll give you an example. We have it. You have a person, you see in a positive light, and then you're in need of a favor. And you did favor badly. And you approach him and he turns you down. And you felt he should have done you the favor. All the good feeling you had to him in Dilt's mouth in the moment evaporates. All you see is your hurt, your disappointment that he did not accommodate and respond to your request. Now this person, unless he takes control of himself, when he meets people, if this person's name is mentioned, he's not going to have anything positive to say about that person. Why? Because all he feels at this moment is the hurt and the disappointment that this man did not address this request. That's the reality. Haman, being the ultimate deprecator, having no capacity to appreciate spirituality, all he saw was the negativity of the Jewish people. And he processed it with that negative lens. Therefore, he knew exactly how to put the dagger straight into Achashverosh's heart. And that's how he depicted the Jew. That's what it's about. If a Jew speaks Lashon Hara, why was the Jew endowed with speech? Because that is the faculty, the spiritual faculty, to activate forces which go beyond this existence, which are eternal forces, unfathomable forces. Because when you study the Torah, it has to be verbalized. That's why man was endowed with the spiritual faculty to activate the Torah, which is unlimited, which is infinite. And it's a misappropriation of a spiritual faculty to use it to demonstrate exactly what Amalek is all about, which is deprecation. Because if a person would see the full picture, you wouldn't speak negative about anybody, unless it's for constructive reasons. So that's not being negative. But if it's being negative, that means you're already focusing only on one point. But how to use the power of speech? You know, the pharmaceuticals, they came up with a medication. It costs the certain medications, injections. People have prostate cancer. One injection is $6,000. That's, and if not for the copay insurance, nobody could afford it. A person that has all this serum, they inject people, and he pours it down the drain. What is he doing? You know what the value of that serum is? You know how many people's lives you could actually save or put on hold that they shouldn't succumb to the advancement of prostate cancer? How do you do it? Because the person doesn't understand the value. Either he doesn't value people's lives, or he doesn't understand the value of what that serum is. The power of speech is something not to be fathomed. It's a spiritual faculty. How do you use it in the most sinister way? To emulate, which something God despises, because it only brings out the worst in a person, which is ultimate deprecation. The Chofetz Chaim writes in the introduction to his work on Lashon Hara, he cites a Zohar. You know, we find the blessing to Yaakov was Hakol Kol Yaakov. The voice is the voice of Jacob. What is the voice of Jacob? So Chazal tell us, the Midrash tells us, it's tefillah and the study of Torah. When we pray, we verbalize those words. That's the voice is the voice of Jacob. And Torah, it has to be articulated, as we mentioned. That's what it was endowed for. It was given for that reason. Person takes that power of speech and he speaks Lashon Hara. You speak lies. You slander. What did you do to your mouth? The power of speech, the mouth has been putrefied. The mouth is the faculty through which speech is expressed. That's how we articulate with our mouths, our tongue. But what was in that mouth? What passed through that mouth? Something that putrefied the mouth. Because Lashon Hara and lies, all that represents the most negative element in existence. So now, if now you speak Torah or you pray to God, every word that comes out of your mouth is now putrefied with that previous Lashon Hara that was spoken. You tefillah, you pray with great kavanah, but the words that pass through that mouth, which are expressed, articulated, everyone becomes tainted. And therefore, it's minimized almost to no value due to the Lashon Hara that you spoke. So the Chofetz Chaim writes, the reason why our Torah doesn't meet its mark, and our tefillah, our prayers, our supplications are not, they fall on deaf ears because they're very seriously deficient, because what's attached to them is that impurity of the Lashon Hara. And this is based on a Zohar. On a Zohar. There's a discussion in the Talmud, two Amoraim, two rabbis of the Talmud. Each one says, do you realize that a child less than bar mitzvah, the Torah he studies has greater value than our Torah. Although we're advanced at a special level, the child less than bar mitzvah, the vapor that comes out of his mouth is more pure than ours. He says, how could it be? He says you cannot compare hevel sheyesh lo chet, yesh bo chet, level she'en bo chet. Vapor that's tainted with sin and vapor that's not tainted with sin. When the child, even if he says something out of order, of course he's a minor, there's no liability. It doesn't have any negative consequence. So when he studies the Chumash, which is very elementary, the words that come out of his mouth are pure. It's untainted vapor. When nobody's perfect. Even if we do tshuva, is it sufficient as a correction? Only God knows. So our vapor is yesh bo chet. Sin has passed through our lips at some level. If that's the case, the Torah we study does not have the same effect as the Torah that's studied by these young children. Therefore, the Talmud says, when it's time to rebuild the temple, we don't interrupt the studies of those young children, because the world stands on the vapor that comes out of their mouths. Because it's vapor which is pure. When that Torah, they articulate those words, it must be at the most elementary level, doesn't make a difference. Because it's vapor which is untainted. Our is tainted. Therefore, it doesn't have the same value. So them we cannot interrupt. Our Torah study, we do interrupt. Because it doesn't have that innate value of the children. We say Talmud Torah keneged kulam. Torah is the ultimate. But the Talmud tells us that when you study Torah, it could be a life potion or it could be a death potion. And it cites verses. Now the question is, if what actually provides and gives you relevance to eternity, which is life in the physical and the spiritual sense, how could those same words actually terminate a person's spiritual future and bring about havoc? How? So the commentators explain, what about if you study Torah with a sinister intent? For instance, I'll give you an example. Somebody's giving a lecture, a Torah lecture, and you prepare the lecture and you spend endless hours preparing because you're going to refute him to show the man he knows nothing. So in what context are you studying and utilizing that Torah? As a weapon, as a sinister weapon. If you take Torah, which is the ultimate, and you pervert it and put it in a context which it has no relevance to, not only does not advance your life, it will destroy your soul. That's called lekanter. That's called with a sinister intent. And that's exactly what Haman was. To use the power of speech, which was endowed to you to bring about the ultimate, and misappropriate and use it in a destructive context, where it's not for constructive reasons, just to speak negative about other people, it brings about a very negative consequence. And that's why Lashon Hara is so serious for that reason. And that's why ultimately becomes a leper. Because this is a spiritual endowment which was endowed to specifically to advance your spirituality to meet the objective of creation. That's exactly what it's all about. Even though a person doesn't make a vow, doesn't take an oath, but you give your word. The Talmud speaks about a case, if you give your word, and then you go back on your word. And when you gave the word, the person you gave your word to, he actually relied on you. And if you don't carry through, there's a disappointment. You're considered as what? A person who lacks in integrity. And the person's classified as a person, a ruach chacham nochei menu. The rabbis are not happy with this kind of person. He becomes like a semi-persona non grata among the rabbis. How do you not carry through with your word? Well, I didn't take an oath. Doesn't make a difference. You give your word, and the person relied on you. You have to carry through. That's what it is. But again, why? There's a story where Yaakov Kamenetsky, Zecher Tzadik Levrocha, when he came from Europe, Lithuania, he was a Rav in Toronto, Canada, in the 30s, early 40s. And on Pesach, we're very careful about chametz, very careful. And among the Hasidim, they're so careful even something that's baked with the highest level of certification, they will not allow water to come in contact with the matzah, with matzah meal or matzah. Why? Because they're concerned there may be some flour intermingled in the baked product, which didn't become dough. If water comes in contact with it, it can become leavened. And Hasidim, all Hasidim assume this stringency. Lithuanians, people not Hasidim, don't. Okay? Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky is a rabbi in Toronto. Who do you think his constituency was? It may have been observant people, but they were not the most learned. So the standard of kashrus, of dietary laws, was not the most advanced. And everybody wants to invite the rabbi to his house, for a meal on Pesach. You open your house. Rabbi Yaakov's custom was he ate what we call knedlach. He ate matzah balls. Chassidim don't eat matzah balls on Pesach because it's matzah meal with water. He did. But he said to his people, he says, I don't eat gebruchts. I don't allow the flour, the matzah to come in contact with water. And all you people do, if that's the case, I can't eat in anybody's house. Okay? But of course, that wasn't the case. He said it to avoid all the landmines that were out there. But when he said it, he committed himself. From that time going forward, he will never eat what we call the matzah that comes in contact with water. His family, his children, they do. Because once he gave his word, doesn't back down on his word. You have to abide by your word. You have to be truthful. The Talmud tells us, God's signet is truth. You speak, you have to back up your word. You can't renege on your word. And especially the faculty of speech, which is a spiritual faculty, and utilizing that and then backing down on it, that's a misappropriation. As a result of that, even though it's not bound with consequences of lashes, but still it's a breach of its sacredness, and therefore you have to abide by whatever your verbal commitment is for that reason. We're going to stop here.